Well, you know that the last few weeks we've been talking about Sabbath keeping, and at council on Monday evening, we discussed some ways that we might be able to help one another understand what that is for each of us, and as a community of faith, we can begin to see how that works out in our life. I keep saying that, we'll take time, people can share all about the Sabbath that they had this past week. But what we're going to do is, we seem to be making use of a lot of pictures these days, and our story wall certainly shares a lot of pictures. And so we're going to invite you as individuals to add a picture to, there will be a portion of the story wall dedicated to Sabbath keeping. And so if you've taken a picture at some point over the week that, or during the time that you have observed Sabbath, as we've been talking about it, we encourage you to bring that picture, and we'll put it up, maybe just a little note with it so that we can identify it and put it up on the wall. What does that look like? Well, I don't know. What do you do when you practice Sabbath keeping? Are you sitting in a beautiful surroundings where there's a particular item that has drawn you into a time of reflection? Have you joined together with family and had a wonderful meal together with family or friends or both? It's a lot of those things. And so if you have specifically during a period of reflection and quiet invited and had a family meal together, or have gone for a walk and have observed something, take a picture of it and share it with us on the story wall. So please do that. This morning I want to continue on with our Sabbath keeping focus. And this morning we're going to move to a few years later in the life of the Israelites. And we're going to find ourselves in the 5th chapter of Deuteronomy, although it sounds quite familiar as though it were back in the 20th chapter of Exodus, because it is again the 10 Commandments. And then I'm going to share a little thought on the 10 Commandments before we specifically go into this text. Deuteronomy chapter 5, picking it up in the 12th verse. Observe the Sabbath day, to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Father, we grant that as we open again these ancient words, that you will open our ears and our hearts to receive that which you have for us as your word to us this day, individually and collectively as a community of faith. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. You know those ancient words, chiseled on a bunch of flat stones and then smashed, are still around today. I want to share just a little writing from writer, preacher, teacher, pastor Erwin McManus in his book, An Unstoppable Force, as he reflects on the 10 Commandments. I found it very interesting because sometimes these ancient words Well, that's what they are. They're ancient words, and so we just kind of leave them there. He takes a fresh take on them, and so he's dusted off those ancient stone tablets, so to speak, and he's done that by daring to look at the Decalogue or the Big Ten in a whole different way. And instead of looking at this list of do's and don'ts as the highest possible rung human beings may strive to reach on creation's ladder, McManus suggests that the Ten Commandments are actually the lowest possible standard of human living. It's not that the behaviors ordered by God to the Israelites in the wilderness aren't commendable. And it's not that the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments isn't an excellent guide for human justice. It's just that the Ten Commandments aren't heaven's standards for Christ followers. McManus goes on to write this: they are not the standards by which the angels live. They are not God's attempt to pull us up beyond the human into the spiritual. The Ten Commandments are the lowest possible standards of human living. Stop to consider what they demand of us. Maybe it would help if we rephrased them in everyday language, and then he says, here goes. Hey, could you stop killing each other? Oh yeah, by the way, could you not steal each other's stuff? And it would be really helpful if we wouldn't lie to each other either. And here's a thought. Could you not take other people's husbands and wives and just sort of like keep your own? McManus declares that anything below these standards is choosing to live like an animal or a barbarian. The Ten Commandments don't call us to the extraordinarily spiritual life. They call us to stop dehumanizing one another. The law is the minimum of what it means to be human. The minimum. The reason the law condemns us isn't because of our inability to live up to an extraordinary measure. We couldn't even pass the test with a D. When God gave Moses the Ten Commandments, God was establishing a nation for himself. God was giving them the tools to form the ethos that through honoring him would result in the nurturing and the elevation of the human spirit. Well, last week we left the Israelite folk at Mount Sinai, getting the goods from Moses after a period of smoke, fire, and thunder on the mountain God encountered. Walter Brueggemann writes, at Sinai, Israel made a defining choice. It decided to trust the God who made heaven and earth, to rely on the guaranteed reliabilities of the creation, and to avoid the anxiety that comes from loss of confidence in the sureness of the Creator and the goodness of creation. The problem was, it was a great covenant. It was a great defining choice for the people. It was just a little harder to keep. Living it out. The oath of allegiance to Yahweh is sworn in Exodus chapter 24, but by the time we get to the 32nd chapter, that's not that many chapters later. Moses has been gone for a long time, you see. He was up that mountain for 40 days and nights. That's a long time. And the people had had enough with this perceived hoax, that this thunder and smoke stuff going on up on the mountain was actually God himself speaking to Moses. And so they came up with a more brilliant plan. And that was, forget this thing going up on the mountain. We, as human beings, we can create our own gods and get into worship. And so they pooled their resources and they took matters into their own hands. You remember this story. The result of making their own gods was a disastrous one. And then when Moses got a wee bit testy about what they had been doing, what did he do? He smashed the tablets that God had chiseled. All that work, all that smoke, all that fire, gone for naught. And the result was that God's covenant that he made with his people at the base of Mount Sinai was broken. It was null and void. No longer existed. And the nation was on its own. But we know how Moses reacted. Some might call Moses a whiner. But day and night he pleaded with God not to take away the covenant relationship that had been established. Over and over and over again he pleaded with God, and a combination of that pleading and a greater forgiving God changed things. Had it not been for that, well, it may have stayed that way, and not even Paul Harvey could have told us the rest of the story. But you see, even beyond Israel's disobedient anxiety, they just couldn't deal with the waiting stuff. Yahweh was prepared to begin again and to establish a new covenant. But this time he does not give the 10 commandments of Exodus 20, but instead he provides a whole new regime of commands. We find that in Exodus chapter 34. And with this new set of rules, there is only slight overlap with the original set. But amongst all of that overlap, we read this in Exodus 34, verse 21. 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. Lots changed. But the word from God was Sabbath keeping was still on the table. And so with the broken covenant restored and Sabbath continuing to be a core commandment, Israel left Sinai. And eventually they would come to the Jordan River. And what's so important about the Jordan River in this story is that on the other side of the river was the promised land. That which they had been promised. And a whole lot of other things took place before they got there. And that's for another day. But they were ready to enter at long last the promised lands. Generations had died. And there was a new generation standing there. Moses didn't even make it. A long time had passed since Sinai, and so Moses stops at the Jordan and gives Israel instructions for the new land. And they were instructions indeed, 30 chapters of instructions. But amongst them were those commandments given again. The desert and the promised land were worlds apart. One dry, barren, food and water deprived, and the other the land of milk and honey. And Moses knew Moses knew that affluence was about to fall upon the people. Moses knows that affluence, as they enter into the promised land, will create a crisis in covenant faith. The new land will be so great that they will be tempted to forget Yahweh altogether. Why do we need God? We got everything, and if we don't have it, we can make it. That's the message today. The new land will be so great they will be tempted to forget God. And, we are good now. We can look after ourselves, but Moses knows what? Moses knows this. Prosperity breeds amnesia. Prosperity breeds amnesia. And so he tells them what? He tells them not to forget where they have come from and who it was who led them and provided for them on their journey to the promised land. You see, it's a new system here now in the promised land. With fertile land producing, productivity will abound, and the goal of life may well be what? To acquire and acquire and acquire. The consumeristic society will soon be in full order. Neighbor competing against neighbor, family competing against family, and the people will be turned into what? Producers and consumers. Familiar story, isn't it? What will happen when that takes place? It will destroy the very fabric of covenantal community, the covenantal neighborhood, which was God's plan in the very beginning. And the land, well, two systems will emerge. Land will be regarded as property and possessions to be bought and sold, traded and used, or in the context of covenant, the land will be understood to be the birthright and an inheritance. One's own land as a subsection of the larger inheritance as the whole people of God. If the land is possession, then the proper ways of life is to acquire more. If the land is inheritance, then the proper way of life is to enhance the neighborhood and extended family, so that all members may enjoy the good produce of the land. You see, that was clear in Sinai. They didn't have much other choice. It was pretty clear to them. But amnesia could play it different for the Israelites in the new land. And so Moses asserts on the cusp of entering the promised land, remember the covenant with God made with us, who are all of us here alive today, because Lot had died from the original covenant. It's contemporary for the new generation. This, writes Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann, is the core argument in the book of Deuteronomy. The center of covenantal teaching in the Bible. We thought it was just an old, boring bunch of lists. No, God has a message in here. See, economy is not a rat race in which people remain exhausted from coercive goals. Rather, it is a covenantal enterprise, is what Moses wanted the people to grasp. A covenantal enterprise for the sake of the whole community. Moses expects the people to reject the materialistic culture and choose instead the covenantal alternative. And what does he do? Moses articulates the commandments moving from no other gods to do not covet. They're pretty much the same as were given at Sinai, with only a slight variation. Sabbath keeping remains the same. And yet there's been one small addition. As at Sinai, all are to rest. But in this new commandments, the words that they may rest like you are added. You see, that may seem a slight change in words, but what that really means, because there's a big list in there of who are to rest. Sabbath is the great day of equality, when all are equally at rest. However, in a society defined by production and consumption, there are huge progressions of performance and therefore of worth and significance. And we all know that all too well in our own society. In such a societal system, everyone is coerced or forced to do what, you say? Well, to perform better, to produce more, to consume more, to be a good shopper. And such a system will inevitably create haves and have-nots, significant and insignificant, rich and poor, people with access and people denied access. Sabbath breaks that progression caused by coercion. Because you see, on the Sabbath, you do not have to do more, sell more, control more, know more. On the Sabbath, you do not have to have your children in ballet or soccer. On Sabbath, you do not have to be younger or more beautiful. And on Sabbath, you do not have to score more. Because this one day, so important that God included it again in all of His commandments in forming the nation. This one day breaks the pattern of coercion. All are like you. Equal worth, value, access, and rest. And I find, as I've been reading these ancient old words over and over again, I find myself pondering. I haven't used that word for a while. That's plunging in and pondering on. Such ideas. Could such a concept work in our day and age? Our society? And when this thought comes to me, in light of all that is happening within our own society and abroad, does the world really have a choice if it wants to survive? If we think back to the original Sabbath keeping, the original command given at Sinai, the reason given for that fourth commandment was because Creator God had rested on the seventh day. But in the new set of commandments, here on the verge of entering into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the commandment to rest is given again, but the reason for doing so was not creation, but remembrance. Remembrance. Moses says, remember the Exodus. Remember the Exodus. Remember that the coercive system of Pharaoh and all that it meant, the brick quotas and the slavery, the no rest, that's gone. You are now free from quotas, from slavery. In Deuteronomy, Moses is very big on remembering, because he knows that forgetting is a huge temptation in an affluent society and environment. Remember, says Moses, that the pattern of coercion, the pattern of being forced to, has been broken. And so I share these words of Walter Brueggemann as a challenge both to myself and I pray to you. Because, you know, we're not living back there in the promised land. But think about all that Moses said in the context of God giving him the commandments to the people. Brueggemann writes this: do you, when you wake up at night, remember what you were supposed to have done? Vexed that you did not meet expectations? Do you fall asleep counting bricks? Do you dream of more bricks that you have to make yet? Or bricks you made that were flawed? We dream so because we have forgotten the Exodus. We don't need to do that anymore. Well, the Sabbath is the break, the regular and public that permits us to remember. Sabbath is the opportunity to recall Egypt and Pharaoh and then remember Yahweh and Exodus. Is it possible to realize that those who remember and keep Sabbath find that they are less driven, less controlled, less coerced, less frantic to meet deadlines, free to be rather than to do all? All because Sabbath is the great festival of freedom. Sabbath is indeed a festival day, but it is also a new social reality that is carried back into days 1 through 6. Not just about one day. It affects it all. And I submit to you that people who keep Sabbath and are able to do it consistently live all 7 days differently. And so perhaps Moses says to each of us today, as he did to the Israelites on the edge of the promised land, our task is to 7 our lives. To 7 our lives. Let us pray. Well, all around us, the song of fear calls us to march to the tune of self-protection. We choose to dance to the rhythm of life, O God. While around us the music of greed entices us to join its frenzied drivenness, we choose to dance to the rhythms of life. While all around us the drums of fashion seek to beat us into conformity and desire, we choose to dance to the rhythm of life. While all around us so many are crippled by a Sabbath-less existence, are in bondage to the devils that drive our world, we praise you, O God, for your healing touch, for your call of Sabbath rest and Sabbath-inspired work, for daily manna and the freedom of sharing, for joyful enoughness and comfortable justice. May we learn, O God, to dance to your Sabbath rhythms a little more each day. And may our dancing bring healing and freedom to all those who receive our invitation to join us in the rhythms of life.